Good afternoon, one and all. It's always a pleasure to learn something new, though we are always talking about. As I said, that artificial intelligence, we can say that it's a new fad, but it is very different. Otherwise, in the normal parlance, before this terminology, artificial intelligence came into being, we were always thinking that artificial would always never be catchy in the sense that one always wanted something original. But according to me, it will be the first word of artificial intelligence where actually one feels that artificial intelligence is carrying a way forward in life. And as they say, it is the next thing to continue to remain. And rather, of late, we have been talking about that what should be the role of artificial intelligence in the judicial setup and other aspects. We're also talking the homes are more artificially intelligent. But what are the ways forward in the judicial setup as to how we could use the artificial intelligence for disseminating knowledge, for gathering knowledge, and for due diligence, prediction technology, legal analysis, and automation of documents, intellectual properties, and electronic billings, and so on and so on. When we discuss this topic, one name of Avinash Ambale, a renowned data scientist, came to our mind. And when we said that we as a professional wanted certain better issues which could be discussed upon, which could help in moving the judicial setup with the use of artificial intelligence in the right way forward. But there are certain shortcomings because they say that the normal intelligence and artificial intelligence as such cannot per se have the same. It has its own advantages and disadvantages. They say that any technology is rather to be used as a servant and not to master them. You can master them, but you should not make it as a master as such. And Mr. Avinash has been on different platforms. He has shared platforms with different judges wherein the insights have been given. He has been recognized on different platforms for his vast input and knowledge being shared on the platform of artificial intelligence. And taking into the consideration during COVID-19, we are saying new is the normal. I would also rather add further that artificial intelligence is another new way to normal. And what are the ways and means to move forward in this aspects? We would request Mr. Avinash Ambale, who has been kind enough to accept our invite and to share his knowledge on a topic which not only at the first brush, but even otherwise, would continues to stimulate a mind which is always willing to learn and move forward in life. Over to you, Mr. Ambale.
Thank you, Mr. Vikasrata. Thank you for having me on the program. Great to be able to talk. First off, good afternoon to everybody who's attending, respected judges and lawyers. As Mr. Vikasrata said, I have absolutely no qualifications in the law. He did say it, but I'm saying it explicitly. So if I make any mistakes of omission or commission in terms of talking about the law, it's all mine. That said, one of the things I was just thinking about talking, instead of going into the history of AI and law, which is rather long-winded, one of the things that I thought we will talk about, and I'd be really happy if we could interact, if you could just put in your questions in the comments to make Mr. Vikas Chatrit and team will take it by text, and I'd be happy to make it as interactive as possible because I'm aware this is not a statistical audience and vice versa. So feel free to put in as many questions as you would like and we'll make it interactive. That said, so one of the things that I thought we would do to start off is to look at how would you go about building a law practice where you could go and sue artificial intelligence algorithm, hypothetically. Of course, this is hypothetical. So that is one of the things that we thought that could be of interest. Of course, talking about the history and the usage of AI will kind of be covered under the whole premise that if you know how you deconstruct how artificial intelligence is used outside of the law and how it can be quote unquote sued, we can figure out how it can in turn be used within the settings of the law itself and the judiciary. So that was the starting thought process. So let me start with a concrete example of what I faced while booking a ticket from Bangalore to New York early in March. So I booked my ticket, and obviously the pandemic and the lockdowns happened across the globe, as we all know. And then the airline decided to refund my tickets. I had a pop-up offer on the internet when I took this ticket up, which said a low-cost EMI. And I take that low-cost EMI. And of course, flights were canceled and the airline refunded my original flight fee. But then the question is, who refunds the cost of the EMI, which I had already taken out? And that is a question of the legal angle of who do you now go after, because this decision was made by an automated system about giving me credit, about giving me the best pricing, about giving me a very minimal cost, I would call it EMI. So this, in a sense, would be what you would call quote unquote AI in whatever form and shape you define it, where a decision in terms of if I am, and I've been on the other end of it, so I know this. So if I am on a Chrome browser on a Macintosh versus an Apple Macintosh versus an Android browser, Android operating system, then the pricing that is shown to me when I search for flights is completely different from when I'm sitting on another, let's say, Mozilla browser, hypothetically, but it's real. So these are the multiple elements that go into making a decision that the AI takes in to make a decision on what pricing it offers me at the point of when I search for a ticket on the internet. So as a consumer, and this is the area of the law that I can talk about because I'm a consumer, I would not be able to speak about constitutional law or very technical aspects of it. As a consumer, what I can see is that this decision is made for me automatically by a system over which I have absolutely no control. So this decision in terms of the pricing is made for me based on where I'm sitting, which is location. It is based on where I am browsing to the site from, whether it is a mobile phone, which kind of tells the AI that it means that this person is possibly on the move. So the pricing could be a little higher, lower, whatever. Or if I am a resident in one place, or if I'm looking for a ticket for Bangalore to New York, sitting in Chennai, maybe they think I'm not serious enough. Whereas if I'm sitting in Bangalore looking for a ticket from Bangalore to New York, the intent or the ability to buy something is seen as or perceived as being higher. So all of these multifarious factors go into this AI that makes this automated decision that tells what pricing it should be displayed to me as an individual or a cohort of people like me at any given point of time. So this question is, so if I then, going to the second point, so then I make the decision to buy the ticket, and there's the option of a low-cost EMI shown up to me. And this is not by a bank. This is by a third party that is aggregating data from multiple sources. And then telling me that this is my credit profile, I can qualify for a very low cost, like a 1% annual or 2% annual, I don't remember the exact number, EMI on the cost of my flight ticket. So this again is a decision that's made by an AI. And in a scenario like this, where the whole airline canceled the flights, but then I paid up the cost of the interest for the 1.5 months that I had not flown, but I paid for the ticket in advance. Who is covering the cost of it? Am I eating the cost? Is the airline eating the cost? The bank is not providing it. So this is a question where you figure out if I were in a very tortuous country like the United States, who do I sue? Do I sue Google for showing me a flight result that was completely different? Do I go after Priceline? Do I go after United Airlines? Do I go after Uplift, who is a provider of this buy now, pay later EMI? So this is where I thought I would deconstruct this whole thing to look at the legal, when I say the legal, not so much the application of AI within the law itself, which Of course, there's a lot of documentation about it, and I'd be happy to talk about it as well. But this might be, if that is of interest, this might be an area where legal practices can be built up. And I know in the United States, at least, firms like DLA Piper, which are one of the larger firms, are building up their practice areas that are focused on how safe your AI practices are and offering this as a service to corporates. So maybe this is an area that we could talk about. Of course, I'm more than more than happy to take questions and comments if we have to change direction in completely another direction. But this is something that might be worthwhile looking at in terms of saying, how can we in India start to look at how do we build something that can contest these decisions that are being made for us sight unseen by algorithms or by AIs, where these decisions are made in terms of at least the consumer law, in terms of where these decisions are made without us as consumers knowing anything about it. And if somebody were to challenge it, who would challenge it at the end of the day? So this is, I think, an emerging aspect of the law where it intersects with consumer practice and AI, which is something that can be an area of focus for building up practices. So good or bad, there is no precedent. So the case law that we will have to look at is something that has to be built up from scratch. There is a lot of literature on the history of AI and the law. It goes back to when the whole term AI was itself introduced in the 1950s, when artificial intelligence as a phenomenon, as a terminology was formulated by scientists at Dartmouth. And then they introduced a symposium called Mechanization of Thought Processes. Around that time is when people started thinking about how do you mechanize thought processes across various different professions, including the law. So the very first academic paper on the intersection of law and AI came about in 1956 or 57, which is called To the Law Machine, by a professor called Dr. Lucien Mail, somewhere in France. So the history of AI and law is fairly old. So we would not, unless somebody is a keen historian, a keen student, or has a keen interest in the history of AI and the law, I think we would spare that discourse now, but we could go into the applications of it, of course, in terms of where it is used today, and use that to be able to deconstruct how AI system, quote unquote, is being used today in terms of making decisions outside of the legal world, and how that can be brought into the legal world as well. So if I go back to the travel example I talked about, all of that is happening, of course, on the hyperscale internet world, because there's a lot of data. All of us are voluntarily and otherwise donating a lot of data to the hyperscale internet giants. And so there's a lot of data that is being collected in what people term the bit, as in the bits and bytes, bit credit marketplace. So all of us are crediting bits and bytes or our digital footprints into the accounts of, I see live on Facebook at the top of our screens here. So there is Facebook. We are sharing our bits and bytes or digital footprints in crediting them into the accounts of Facebook, into the accounts of Google, Instagram, or Instagram being a Facebook property, which is eventually ending up at a commerce site. When I say commerce site, it could be an e-commerce site like Amazon, or it could be a commerce travel place like Priceline or Expedia. So all of these different digital bits and bytes that are being hoovered up or vacuumed up by the hyperscale internet giants like Facebook and Google are ultimately going into a transactional decision on where we swipe our credit cards or we use our net banking accounts to be able to make a purchase whether it's a purchase of a good or it's purchase of a service like what we use. And there are marketplaces like Uber for lawyers in the United States. I'm sure there are in India as well, called Up Counsel, where you can hire a lawyer, pay for them, or pay for the services on the internet. So ultimately, if you were to look at the goal of internet as internet e-commerce, as a transactional store, as a place where you discover information and eventually transact on it as a commerce platform, that comes under the whole gamut of what you would technically call consumer law, because be it Joe Public consumer like you and I, or business consumer, it is a consumer nonetheless. So I would think that would fall under the ambit of consumer law. So how do you govern and regulate the processes that are increasingly automated? When I say automated, I mean where the decisions in terms of what is presented to you right from get-go, in terms of when you type into your Google search screen, flight tickets from Bombay to Delhi, the results that are displayed to you from that point, the get-go onwards, these decisions in terms of what pricing is displayed to you are not exactly transparent. And to the point when you actually punch in your credit card or your swipe your QR code or do your UPI or whatever, that pricing that is offered to you and the discounts and the cashbacks that are offered to you are personalized, completely personalized, if not to you as an individual, but to a cohort of individuals that are similar to you. So this, in this whole context, is what you would call consumer law scenario, which could be governed and regulated in terms of setting up a practice to see how AI, to see how this can be quote unquote litigated if we were to, and how is it that AI is being used in this scenario is possibly worthwhile looking at when you deconstruct that to figure out how AI can be used in the legal world as well. So I would think that makes a lot of sense in terms of how the law is being caught on a back foot, because it is right, it's behind technology in terms of regulating how things are happening on the algorithmic marketplace, if I were to call it that, or as an eminent legal scholar, Tim Wu, Columbia, calls it the attention economy. How our attentions on the internet is being capitalized by these algorithms. So those areas might be questions worthwhile looking in terms of how do we build up AI practice within a legal group to be able to go on and take on questions that will address the intersection of the law and technology, or more specifically, the law and AI. But before I go into that, obviously, how is it used within the law itself? As Mr. Chatra talked about earlier, obviously, one of the things is easier information retrieval. How is the AI used within, the reason we talked about Google is how do you create a Google for looking up case law, for instance? And I'm sure there is LexisNexis, but how good is LexisNexis in being able to figure out, is it as user-friendly as Google? Is it as intuitive as Google, where you type in the first few words and the whole search sentence appears almost in and of itself by magic? So the questions of information retrieval, I think, are one of the first questions that come to mind when you look at an AI in the context of how it can help and aid the legal profession and the judicial profession in terms of how to organize information better. So the underlying context, obviously, is we talked about Google in the context of hyperscale, but we've all seen, and I quote an example specifically from an academic work, two legal scholars working at the intersection of AI and law, whose names escape me at this specific point of time, but they ran this super successful project in the European Union called the BEST project, which was looking at harmonization of data across various European Union countries to be able to make what you would call machine readable law. They go to Google because they're publishing this impactful paper in terms of what it means for AI to have an impact in online dispute resolution. So they type in online dispute resolution and AI into a Google search keyword as the Google search keyword. And the search results that come up point to only themselves. So yeah, one of the professors' names is Arno Loder. So it points to all these professors as the experts in the field of AI and online dispute resolution. Obviously, they're very thrilled that, Google, almighty Google tells them that, they are the only experts in the field of AI and online dispute resolution or ODR. Then they go back to Google and do a little bit of a tweak in terms of the keyword search that they enter. So they add a space between on and line. So instead of online as one simple continuous word, they say on space line. And then there's 20 more search results that come up. And reason why I bring about that is this is, we earlier talked about, or Mr. Chatra talked about the shortcomings of AI. So while Google in and of itself is brilliant, why can it not organize the corpus of law as well as, let us say, it's organizing content on the web? Is largely because the content or the corpus of legal language is subject to various interpretations. So like we just looked at the example of a space between on and line in a Google search word provides vastly different results. So if you were to look at this in the context of actual, say, hypothetical or a hypothetical court case, the impact on the retrieval of information on the court case would be potentially disastrous if you were to take search results from a string that is completely unrelated to what you were actually intending to search. So one of the biggest shortcomings in that context that we are talking about, while it can be used for information retrieval really well, so in a sense, using hyperscale Google type search engine, AI search engine to be able to retrieve information across a wide variety of legal corpora. The biggest problem with that is bulk of the legal texts are not structured in a way that it makes it possible for the AI to read it, interpret it, and get a meaningful result that is consistent each single time. Not to mention, of course, that bulk of the text is not just in English, but it is also a mixture of English and Latin. The court judgments are sometimes in a mixture of local languages and English, of course, not specifically completely local language, but makes references to the languages, refers to statutes and bylaws and sections that are indexed. When I say indexed, it means that they're tagged within the database that is accessible to this hypothetical Google-style information retrieval engine that lawyers and judges could use. All of these different problems surface when you're trying to create a Google for AI. And that's one of the biggest shortcomings why somebody like a LexisNexis, who do have several data scientists on team at their offices somewhere in North Carolina, I guess, are trying to fix in terms of how, when you go into LexisNexis, how can you retrieve information much quicker in a Google-style way, where you enter words in what you would call, I mean, if you've used a smart assistant like a Siri on your Apple phone, or an Alexa, or Google Home, or a Google Assistant, how intuitive it is in terms of you tell, I don't want to trip off my Alexa or Siri by saying, hey Siri, what's the weather today? And you get the results immediately. So if you want to make search this intuitive for a lawyer, that can speak to an Alexa and say, hey, Alexa, what is the case precedent of Roe v. Wade, or whatever that you're asking it for. But it cites the whole history as relevant to a lawyer than a layperson. Then there's a whole body of work that needs to be done in terms of creating a common corpus that adheres to common standards. When I say common standards, standards which the AI can read, interpret, and understand, so that it outputs meaningful results. And that's one of the biggest shortcomings. And how do we address that? And it is not something that me sitting across the table as a statistician, as a data scientist, whatever name you want to throw at us, can solve independently. It works by people like yourselves, like lawyers and judges and lawmakers sitting across with statisticians, trying to figure out how this all works together. What is the bedrock, which is the foundational stone of the different languages, and what harmonizes it together? And the reason I mention this is Google. I keep going back to Google, of course, because that's the AI superpower of the day. Google's Translate, which most of us have used, I don't know how good it is at translating Indian languages, but for French and English and French and Spanish and multiple other languages, it's brilliant. And the reason it got its kickstart was because it used extensive documentation. And I think we have that too within India. It used the Hansard Gazette in Canada that is bilingual. The Gazette is published in French and English. So there's a huge corpus of information that, because it's a Gazette, it has to be legally the exact same language in English as well as French. So Google trained its engines, its language translate engines using AI on top of the Gazette. So it was able to decipher the patterns in one language and deduce that, or infer that these patterns in language A, English, meant the exact same thing in another language, French, because they occurred in the same exact statistical pattern or the statistical frequency. So if you were to look at that as a precedent, say that we have that in India with the Gazette, which is Hindi and English, that is something that we can create together. And that's where a combination of lawyers, lawmakers, and data scientists put together can address the shortcoming that we just talked about due to the bedrock of the legal corpus being in various different standards, styles, conventions, etc., not being readable by the AI, hence not being able to provide information in as intuitive as a way as a Google would when you're using it for lay, when I say lay people, consumers like you and I in a non-lawyer world search. So that's one of the biggest things that we could look at, figuring out how that problem collectively by a community, not just of data scientists, but of lawyers, with lawyers and lawmakers, that can be solved. So that's the, I think information retrieval is one of the biggest use cases of AI within the legal and judicial domains. And the shortcoming being that the corpus is not really adequate to be able to provide effective and accurate information retrieval. So that is something that is, I would think, the single biggest application. The second one, of course, we just talked about Alexa or Siri or Google. The second one, I was on a panel last year when people were talking about transcription in courts still being manual. Transcription agencies that are obviously lagging behind in terms of time. It takes a long time for a transcription to come out, a transcript of a voice recording or a judge's ruling to come out. The good and bad is that transcription or voice to text on multiple platforms. Of course, these are all, unfortunately, I'm talking about American platforms, Google, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. These are widely popular and fairly accurate. The transcription accuracy is over 90%, and in some cases 95% for lay language. Of course, it can be trained to read, if not read, interpret legal language even better than what it has been doing. So transcription, I think, would be the first use case. It can just fit in. I would not be over prescriptive and say it can fit right in. But one of the first scenarios that can be used right away, straight off the bat from what you would call commercial off-the-shelf software, is transcription. And whatever the law of the land is, of course, that has to be recognized. But that said, if that permits it using a Microsoft or an Apple or an Amazon or whatever, to be able to transcribe services, transcribe voice to text, so that the turnaround time to provide transcripts to lawyers, their counsel, lawyers and defendants and the entire team of plaintiffs and everybody else is much quicker. So transcription is one of the key areas I would think that would help. You don't traditionally see that as an AI service, but given that the rise of the digital assistants is on, there is a lot of room for improvement, of course, within the legal domain, but it is fairly accurate nonetheless, and can be used to be able to provide these transcripts. The shortcomings, of course, I kept talking about, it is not built for a specific purpose. In this case, transcribing legal and judicial language into written language, or voice into written language. And that, of course, is a question of training. When I say training, the more data you give it, the more you work on it. I think the initial pass, you would have the transcriber or voice-to-text engine transcribing bulk of the text and a human correcting them. And then eventually, over a period of time, that does bulk of the heavy lifting. The voice transcription by Alexa or a Siri or whatever does the bulk of the heavy lifting. And Amazon also has free, what they call APIs, application program interfaces, that can plug into any legal software, just take voice, convert it into text, and hey presto, things work. So transcription after information retrieval, I think that's one of the key areas that could be used. The third area is, we talked about the shortcomings earlier on. How do you litigate against an AI? And this is in the area of decision making in and of itself. If an AI can be used to make decisions on behalf of a sentencing judge, what is the data it requires? And is that admissible in a court of law? There are instances, and there's of course a lot of backlash against this as well, where in criminal law, there's an algorithm used in recidivism cases in the United States, an algorithm called Compass, that is used to sentence, sorry, not sentence. Yeah, it is used to, it's used by judges to figure out if the person who is up for parole is likely to recommit the crime recidivism and hence eligible for parole or not. There have been a lot of community backlashes against, I mean, there's a good and bad. There's a good and bad in using algorithms like this, the Compass algorithm, where there's an extensive body of work and literature that shows that this has been inherently biased in criminal law against people of a certain racial or ethnic background or of a certain social background. Hence, the usage of these algorithms in and of itself is illegal. On the other hand, a state high court or a Supreme Court, as they would call it in the United States, the state Supreme Court of Wisconsin, rules that the compass-driven algorithms are or decisions are admissible, because at the end of the day, the algorithm is just providing a decision support and it's not actually making the decision. The human judge is making the ultimate decision in terms of whether the parole is to be accepted or the jail sentence is to be continued. So if I go into a separate area, which is kind of in a jurisprudence kind of area, is what is emerging as what they call robotic common sense as the area of jurisprudence that is coming up. Of course, this is more a matter of doctrine rather than procedural scholarly debate at the intersection of AI and law, that when you consider this case of this Wisconsin Supreme Court and the way it ruled it and the precedent, that robotic common sense. And what it means in this context is what the judges in the state of Wisconsin ruled was to say, while they are not uniform or they're not consistent all the time. If they're uniformly bad or they're uniformly good, that is something that is not within the ambit of human judgment. Whereas a robotic or AI-driven common sense, as they call it, typically means that the algorithm gets better and better over a period of time. And it is consistent in that it is either consistently bad or it is consistently good. And that consistency in terms of being either completely good or completely bad is something that can only improve over a period of time with more and more data. So the reason why the reason why it is going under the larger or broader context of jurisprudence is where robotic common sense is being used as a stand-in for what doctrinal law would call, or the legal fiction would call, a reasonable person in terms of defining what a reasonable person would do. So this is what is emerging as doctrine in terms of what a robotic common sense would imply, which really means that the algorithm or AI in its broader context, what it is really doing is, or what the judges interpret it as doing, is that it is getting better and better over time, and that it is consistently bad or consistently good, which is an order of magnitude different, completely different. I'm not saying it's good or bad, from a human judgment. So take it as it is, use its function as it is, and it is getting better over time and it's consistent, is kind of emerging as a doctrine. Procedurally, is it being followed? Still early days. So this is where I think doctrine in terms of legal scholarship is evolving in terms of the application of AI within law, or where an AI is making decisions or part decisions, which is a third and the biggest area, which is possibly the holy grail of the application of AI within law or within the judicial context, is how do you use an AI to automate decision making. The doctrine is emerging that it is called robotic common sense. Fairly recent, so it might be a while before it catches up with procedural law. But that, at the end of the day, is possibly a precedent and a cornerstone for how you start litigating against an AI-driven decision that is being used in areas outside of the law, like the travel industry that I talked about, or the commerce industry, where you buy product on Amazon, and there's a dispute, and the dispute resolution center is by an AI called SmartCert, at least in the US. So this is making decisions based on AI and game theory in terms of how disputes are resolved on what you would typically call a small ticket, which is sub hundreds of dollars transactions. on Amazon, eBay. This is where I think, if you would call it the holy grail of decision making, or holy grail of AI in the law would be, which is automating decision making itself. If we can look at how it is being used, how decision making is being automated in other areas outside of the law, and then figure out how we can bring it under the ambit of regulation or the law, and then use it within the law itself to be able to automate decision-making processes within the law. I think that holistic or a 360 view approach is what would enable better decision-making or automated decision-making using AI within the legal or judicial domains is what my opinion is. Of course, it is subject to debate. So this is what I would think is a quick overview of what I'd like to talk about. So happy to take questions, Mr. Vikas Chatri. Anything else that you'd like me to talk about? More questions? Happy to.
Yeah. We will ask the participants also to post the questions, those who are watching us on the Facebook as well as on this platform. One question normally which arises is, like we all do see that automated system, whether this automated legal text classification and summarization could be done, and what is the way forward for that?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We were working on, it is being used in the executive branches of the United States government. I can't name names at this point of time, but summaries and classification within the legal, when I say legal, these are lawmakers at the end of the day, the executive branch of the United States government is already starting to use text summaries, AI to provide text summaries from several dozen briefings to create like a one-page dossier for somebody to read. So that technology is fairly advanced, fairly advanced. It is the shortcoming with that is, of course, it is super duper expensive. It costs tens of millions of dollars to get one instance set up and running. So the technology exists. It is right at this point of speaking, it's scaling out into the real world, into not so much the judicial branches of the United States government, but definitely the executive. So that has a lot of scope. Text summarization is one of the biggest areas that is being looked at right now. And it's fairly accurate. When I say accurate, over 95% accurate. And in sometimes, in very recent times, people say it's very hard to distinguish between a human-created summary versus an AI-created summary. So it's almost that eerily or creepily accurate. Whether it can be used in India is a question of resources. At the end of the day, I'm sure there are resources to be able to put it together, but it is computationally and financial resource-wise super expensive at this point of time.
And then how does this automated information extraction from legal database and text actually work out?
So the automated extraction from a legal database is again, this is all a subset of the text summary or the what you would call document classification in and of itself. The baseline to that is, as you have seen in your actual physical books, there is an index. You've seen an index that has all the relevant cases, or by whatever categories that the legal text has been classified, those exist as an index at either the back or the front of the book. So that index, or the tags as we call them in the data science world, that index is what we use to be able to create a super layer or metadata over the legal database. And once we have that, it is fairly easy and comprehensive, fairly accurate and easy to be able to retrieve information. Just like, you open up one of the several legal books that you're right behind you, and you go to the index, it's almost as easy as that. So the first step and the most difficult step, the AI exists. What does not exist today in its most comprehensive form is the index. So the index that is in your book, that index in an automatic, sorry, in an electronic form, that is understandable by the AI for the legal world does not exist. Once we create that, that index, then the tools that exist within the AI world can retrieve information fairly quickly and accurately.
This is by Lal Tejwani. How do you see artificial intelligence picking up in the India for legal areas? And any suggestions for engineering graduates in IT/data with law degree can concentrate on artificial intelligence as a vertical practice in India?
So I'll take the latter question first. I was looking through before getting on this webinar. There is this program at IIT Kharagpur that is at the intersection. They do, I think it's a Center for Law and Technology, or I forget what the specific name of that is, but that is one of the areas that jumped out. Talked about earlier. How do you litigate against an AI? How do you look at data transparency? How do you look at data cleanliness? How do you make sure data privacy standards are ensured? Things like these could be emerging areas of practice for a lawyer that is looking to set up a practice at the intersection of law. And I would call it technology, not specifically AI, but all of this is converging towards data and algorithms. The impact of AI in India, I think it's early days. I think it is, fortunately or unfortunately, it's a messy democracy. So it means that the standards and statutes are widely different. So data is also not synchronized or not harmonized, which means that it will take a while to take off. But when it does, it will be massive, because the scale and volume of data available in India, at least in the English-speaking Indian world, is kind of unparalleled. But that needs a critical mass. AI will not take off unless the data underneath it is at a volume critical enough for it to be hitting escape velocity. And that will take a combined team of not just data scientists, but also lawyers and data scientists to be able to work together to make that happen.
The next question could be, like we all speak of risk assessment, pricing, and timeline predictions of litigation using machine learning and artificial intelligence. What do you actually perceive, and how do you see that we should look forward in all this?
So risk perception, the first thing, I mean, if I can take one step back, the first thing is that whatever the machine learning algorithms are putting out is a probability score. It is not a certainty, like when you look at the law and you say, what is the degree of causation that is implied by a certain action? What you're really looking at is assigning a probability to the degree of causation and correlation. So looked at from that context, the risk assessment is essentially a probability to say that out of 10 different factors, these are the various different probability outcomes assigned to these various risk heads, and assigning a weight to them. So that is where the machine learning steps in, because what it can do is create a risk assessment model that takes in data from multiple sources and not just from one specific, if I can call it that, rule book or procedure book, which is what conventional, if I can take a specific example of credit risk assessment in financial scores or civil scores, that takes static data from one set of sources. What the hype and the hope of AI is it can take real-time data from multiple sources to create a risk assessment score that is a little more reflective of real life than a static score like Sybil. So that's where risk assessment models using machine learning could be more accurate. Of course, the shortcoming with that is you provide a lot of data, voluntarily or otherwise, to be able to make this happen.
Next could be, what according to you under the artificial intelligence could be an executable models of legislation?
For legislation, I would think I'm borrowing completely from the Western canon. I'm not.
Of course, one has to take you where it has actually worked upon. What are the fallacies and that's what we said, a way forward.
Yes.
Maybe so we take some things and then we also move a way forward in that. Learning lessons from one is learning lessons from the past and one is learning lessons from the West.
So from the past, the good and the bad from the past is, the automatic translation. So if you can train the AI on the Gazette, the Indian Gazette, the Parliamentary Gazette, that is doing a lot of language translation. That's the one lesson from the past. But from legislative, one of the things that is, which we can borrow from the West is take up an area of law within legislation, let's say tax law, which is what the US and EU focused on, because one of the founding fathers of the intersection of AI and law said tax law is very dry, and apologies to all the tax lawyers out there, but he said it's way too technical. It is something that a computer can easily understand. So tax law in terms of legislation and its implementation in AI is something that lends apparently, not that I know enough of tax law to be able to interpret it, but it is codifiable enough for an algorithm or an AI to be able to interpret it or to make accurate decision outcomes. So tax law is one of the areas that we can look at from the Western canon in legislative practice. Of course, in day-to-day legislative practice, I can talk about the many failures that have happened in Australia and US and UK in terms of where one of the key experiments that was being tried is trying to make the law accessible to common people. If I were to go and read a Gazette, I would not understand the first thing about it. So it tried to create a very simplistic natural language understanding for lay people, and that has not worked as well. So from in the areas of legislation, things that have worked in the Western canon is largely tax law. I don't know if it will, right off the top of my head, without knowing enough about it, whether it has a direct action in Indian legal, but something that's dry and technical. That is not it's possibly an area that could be used within the legislative process as a first step forward.
Yeah. And then the last question we would be taking is, how do you feel that there would be a computation model for the purposes of evidence?
For the purpose of evidence? From what I have seen, and this is, again, I'm sorry, I keep going back to the Western canon. And of course, I live in New York, so I have to talk about the Southern District of New York, which we call as the most powerful thing after the Supreme Court of the United States. So the Southern District of New York allowed electronic discovery and evidentiary admissal as a federal law. So it's now a black letter law in the United States. What it means in terms of computational models are what is more important than the data itself is the metadata. So rather than the content of the emails, when the email was sent, the header, who sent it, where it went from, things like that, which can be used as evidence in a case of, let's say, harassment. I'm just using that as a widely quoted example in the past #MeToo kind of episodes. How do you use evidence, computer gathered evidence, or computable model. This is not so much computable model as computer evidence per se of being admissible in court. The computable models of the evidence gathered, of course, is a different subject altogether, which is subject to what you would call the taxonomy of classification of all of these relevant materials of evidence. And then from that, you create a computable model in terms of, I might be slightly puritanical in my definition of a computational model of evidence means a taxonomy that says scene of crime, I'm using criminal law here, scene of crime, this is the evidence that's tied to the victim, this is the evidence that's tied to the perpetrator. So this is the taxonomy that follows. So that is like a computational model, which we would call a subject-object model. So those computational models exist and are in place. The taxonomy varies from, I would assume, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So that is a whole branch that is being studied. There is a lot of literature on it. And I am unfortunately unaware of how much has been implemented in the Indian scenario, but those models do exist and can be used, at least within the criminal law. From the context of civil law, where you look at primarily electronic evidence, there's a lot of, again, models on the metadata that can be used and gathered and disseminated to be able to use as evidence in civil cases as well.
Yeah. One just I saw on the Facebook, Mr. Aditya Kant says, wondering in coming times how much bearing can the artificial intelligence have on the delivering judgment?
I can hear you. Yeah, is to figure out what is the bulk of the cases. I mean, it's the old 80-20 rule, which has nothing to do with computers. 80-20 rule. What is the 80% of cases that takes 20% of the judge's time, and the 20% of the cases which add a lot of value, but so that statistics is about what is the cases that are, something that a judicial officer, a judge can do autopilot mode. Those that take up first, these are automated. The ones that require a lot of thought and depth, that possibly we will leave out. So I'm assuming I'm using a very standard 80-20 rule, use 80 of those, which are possibly routine and on autopilot mode. And I don't even know what they are. It could be family law, it could be trial law, whatever it is. I think that analysis would be the starting point to figure out what are the touch points within judiciary that can be automated or lend themselves to decision making. The outliers in both cases, statistically, whether it is outliers where it requires a lot of deliberation, that is something that will obviously leave out. As a lawyer, I would think one of the areas that would emerge, I think, I hate to say this, but one of the areas that I would urge every lawyer to get started with is becoming a little more statistically savvy. Because if we are either going to work with an AI, against an AI, or litigate against an AI in the future, it requires a lot of in-depth, if not in-depth, at least enough knowledge to confound a statistician. So I would think that is one of the first things that, if possible, that a lawyer who wants to get into the area of working in with against AI should start is just start getting familiar with some statistical precepts and then move on. I think the other concepts are a little too esoteric to most practitioners of AI itself. So we leave that out, but little statistical training doesn't hurt anybody, I would think. Of course, it is a little difficult to start with, but I would think that is the first step, starting point for any lawyer wishing to set into this field.
Though we had said the last question, since you said the lawyers have to train, what do you feel that the lawyers or any professional, if he wants to actually learn the nuances of artificial intelligence, what is the way forward? How to do that? Are there in books, or is it on the internet, or watching the webinars just like what we are doing? What do you say? I'm just reminded what just Mr. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had inaugurated a session of responsible artificial intelligence for social empowerment, what was shortly known as RAISE. So I will not say raise, but how do we raise our artificial intelligence use in the day-to-day life, and how to cultivate that, because we feel that it's a thing which could continue to grow in.
So I think one of the, definitely all of the sources that you talked about, definitely books, the internet, and webinars. But I think what is more important is if any of you, I wouldn't say more important, is equally as important. If any of you, all of you play cards or any games of betting, just pay a little more attention. I know betting is a black term, or it's not possibly legal in most states. Just, you don't have to put money in it. Just think about it when you're playing poker or bridge or any of those card games or betting on horses. Just start thinking about the outcomes, how the odds are being calculated. Or, even when you're watching a cricket match, when Delhi Daredevils, I don't think they're called Delhi Daredevils anymore, whatever they're called, is playing Mumbai Indians, there are bookies that are offering odds. Just start paying a little more attention to how these odds are being priced. Why is Delhi Daredevils being given 5-2? Or the recent presidential elections in the United States, people give spread odds. So if you start paying a little more attention to those odds, I know gambling is a very bad word to talk about, and people have got into a lot of misery because of that. But if you look at the statistics behind it, how are these odds coming into play? How is this pricing coming into play? That's a super valuable lesson in learning statistics, which is the cornerstone for learning about AI in the law. And if you were to look at a completely different area, which is insurance, actuaries who, like lawyers, are computing risks and premia for people like you and I. All they're doing is calculating the odds of somebody living or somebody dying. So it sounds very morbid, but it's what it is. And I have been told, of course, I can't name names here, but mentors who I've worked with in the judicial field, that motor accident cases, they do pretty much similar. So how are you calculating the odds of life expectancy of an individual? I think things like those in your daily life, start paying a little more attention. I think books and internet are great, but they're very theoretical. So once they start getting theoretical, people start losing interest. I think the games make it a little more interesting, if that's possible.
So one is, according to you, that practice makes a man perfect. So one has to practice more.
So even if you lose a few rupees, I'm not recommending this as a strategy to anybody, but at least pay close attention to poker and whatever the bookies' odds are when the next cricket match is being played.
So it is just like shares, that the one has to look into the market with the sentiment of protection, and it is
exactly.
The investment is subject to risks.
Subject to risk. Past performance is not an indicator of future returns. So, And on that note, there are lawyers that are suing companies because all the decisions, the investment decisions, are made by AI. There's a Hong Kong billionaire who gave, I don't know why he did that, but billions of dollars to a hedge fund that is run by an AI. And of course, that AI was not smart enough, or whatever happened. So it lost a lot of money, and that guy is suing them. So as a lawyer, that is an area of practice you want to get in front of, to say, this is where I should be, because this is where the future of the world is, good or bad. So, if I want to litigate for or against this billionaire, against this hedge fund that is losing a lot of money. It needs to know a little bit more about the internals of the AI. So let me start getting to know about this. In this case, I don't know where it is being litigated, somewhere in Europe. Might be worthwhile as a precedent to start looking at and see how you would fight either for or against this scenario.
So that also gives a flip to the mindset of a professional that there is a scope on this type of litigation also. So for a young professional or any professional, he can think about artificial intelligence not only helps to do fast, but it will also help us to have this thing. So, so thank you, Mr. Avinash. The topic was artificial intelligence, but it was full of intelligence, that I can say. And we thoroughly enjoyed. And to all those participants who are watching us live on the Facebook and on this platform, we would like to announce that with the support of all the participants, tomorrow would be our 250th webinar. So thank you for supporting us in a noble cause. And tomorrow it will be Justice Abraham Matthew, a former judge of Kerala High Court, who will be giving the insights on a warrant and the sessions trial. Do stay connected with us at 4:30. And once again, Mr. Avinash, thank you. And to all the participants, thank you for encouraging us morally to do better and better for the better India for tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay blessed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.